Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 35, The Cold War. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Charles's son Louis, king of Aquitaine, took advantage of domestic instability in the Emirate of Cordoba to expand south of the Pyrenees. However, Charles found himself dealing with a coup in Rome when the relatives of the previous pope attempted to capture Leo, the current pope. Naturally, Charles agreed to guarantee Leo's safety in Rome. While there is no record of the discussions between the king and the pope, the two men clearly came to an agreement since Leo crowned Charles emperor. Honestly, the elevation in status should not have been a surprise, since Charles had advanced beyond the status of a mere king by this time. Moreover, the Eastern Empire was ruled by Empress Irene, who had seized power from her weak son. Still, the coronation was undoubtedly a dramatic step that would have shocked Constantinople. The imperial government in Constantinople quickly learned that the Frankish king had dared to call himself emperor. Obviously, officials were stunned, but it was worth waiting to see how the new emperor presented himself to the Eastern Empire. Soon enough, envoys from both Charles and the Pope arrived in Constantinople. Unsurprisingly, the Frankish envoys wanted to know if Irene would officially recognize Charles as emperor. In addition, the emissaries had another matter to discuss, a marriage proposal. Both rulers were widowers, so Charles had sent a marriage proposal along with the official notice that future communications should be addressed to Emperor Charles. It is hard to imagine that Charles thought that he would move to Constantinople or that Irene would move to Aachen. Charles may have viewed the potential marriage as a means of avoiding conflict between the two empires. Anyway, the proposal would prove to be as controversial as the idea that a Frank could become emperor. Actually, Charles was not the only one sending emissaries. Caliph Harun al-Rashid sent formal envoys to Charles in 801 after he had become emperor, but before he left Italy to return to Frankia. One of those envoys was the Caliph's viceroy in the west, Ibrahim ibn al-Aghlab, who was based in Tunisia. In addition, Abul Abbas, the elephant sent by Harun al-Rashid, reached Aachen in 802. While the gift was generous, it must have cost a fortune to feed the elephant during the months of travel to Aachen. What would the Caliph want from Charles? Probably some form of alliance, or at least cooperation against either Constantinople or the Emirate of Cordoba, or both. It is unlikely that Charles needed any encouragement to maintain hostilities with the Emirate, since his son Louis was besieging Barcelona when the new emperor met with the Caliph's envoys in Italy. However, if Harun al-Rashid wanted a war between the two Christian empires, he would likely be disappointed. Speaking of Louis's war against the Emirate of Cordoba, since Barcelona had fallen, Louis continued to press south against the Emirate, although he soon lost the guidance of William, Count of Toulouse. William founded a monastery in 804 and became a monk himself 2 years later. It is worth asking if William became a monk to avoid trouble with Louis, who may have viewed him as a rival now that he had become an adult. Having resolved his internal issues, Hakam was better prepared to resist Louis's repeated attempts to capture Tortosa. By 809, the Franks and the Emirate had reached a stalemate. No peace treaty seems to have been signed, but both sides limited themselves to raids on each other. While the empire was relatively stable, that stability was not guaranteed. Charles met with his 3 sons for Christmas in 805 and then announced a series of provisions to maintain both internal and external stability. Although there are no records of feuds between noble families, Charles apparently believed that it was necessary to limit conflict between nobles, so no one could bear a shield, spear, or chainmail at home, and anyone who pursued a private vendetta would be banished. Clearly, the empire would continue to expand, therefore it was critical to prevent weapon sales to the regions targeted for expansion. No one could trade independently with the Slavs or the Avars, and no one could sell them weapons. Other provisions regulated military service. As Charles fought campaign after campaign, he had seen the value of cavalry and armored troops since the law of 805 required every man who owned lands with at least 12 peasant families to wear armor when he arrived for the annual campaign. Foot soldiers had initially had axes or short throwing spears, but the new regulations specified a spear, a shield, and a bow for soldiers. The switch to an emphasis on heavy cavalry indicates a wealthier kingdom. Just the spear and wooden shield for a regular soldier was equal to 2/3 the cost of a cow, so a free man would have to be relatively well off to afford the equipment to serve. In addition, the number of men liable for military service was decreased. A free man with 4 slave or tenant farmer families had to serve, but 4 free peasants would have to choose one to represent them. As a result, the annual gathering of the army did not draw away every farmer. While it was not a professional army, it was closer to one. Even though the percentage of men liable for military service had decreased, men still tried to avoid service. Naturally, there were huge fines for men who avoided service, but the officials could be bribed, and lords or abbots could select which of their tenants would be forced to serve, so the system was ripe for abuse. While these new rules would hopefully ensure stability, the key issue was the succession. Charles was 57 years old, middle-aged by today's standards, but elderly by the standards of the time. His father Pippin was only 54 when he died, 3 years younger than Charles. Charles's grandfather, Charles the Hammer, had died at age 53. The emperor was undoubtedly aware that the odds were against him living much longer. Since Charles himself had fought to take his brother's share of the inheritance, he probably recognized that he had not made a better system for his sons. After consulting with his advisors, on February 6, 806, Charles announced that the empire would be divided among his 3 sons by Hildegard, thus ending any suspicion that he had truly planned to establish a lasting empire. Or perhaps he had realized that the empire would not survive his death anyway. Louis, king of Aquitaine, would gain Provence, Septimania, and part of Burgundy. Presumably, Louis would also keep whatever lands he conquered on the other side of the Pyrenees. Pippin, king of Italy, would receive Bavaria, Carinthia, and half of Alemannia, basically the lands bordering northern Italy. Everything else went to Charles the Younger, which meant Neustria, Frisia, Austrasia, Saxony, and the other half of Alemannia. Seniority was decisive, since Charles, the eldest, received the largest and richest part, while Louis, the youngest, received the smallest territory. If one of the brothers died, his lands would be divided among the remaining brothers, unless he had a male heir who would receive his father's lands. Interesting. Little is known about Charles the Younger. Both of his brothers were married and already had children, but he doesn't seem to have married, even though he was the eldest of the 3 legitimate sons. Charles did not neglect his daughters, well, his legitimate daughters, namely Rotrud, Bertha, Gisela, Hiltrud, and Theodrada. When he died, each daughter could choose to marry or enter a convent. None of his daughters had been permitted to marry, but several would have children anyway. It is important to mention that Charles was essentially dividing the empire that he had labored to expand. Did he genuinely expect that his sons would prove any different than previous members of the family and respect each other's lands? Probably not, but he had little choice. At least he made the division while he was still powerful and in consultation with his advisors. Charles had 3 more sons after he became emperor, Drogo, Hugh, and Theodoric, but he did not marry their mothers. Moreover, the sons were not given the usual royal names Pippin, Louis, Charles, or Charlemagne, confirming that they were not intended to rule. It is interesting that one of the sons was named Theodoric, presumably after Theodoric the Great. While there was no major conflict, the borders were far from peaceful. Charles sent his son Charles the Younger on several campaigns against the Slavs in Bohemia, and he crossed the Elbe River several times between 804 and 808. Lands were ravaged and local dukes were killed. Why were there problems with the Slavs? Well, the Frankish border had expanded after Saxony and Bavaria became part of Frankia, reaching next to Bohemia, so it may have been simply disagreements over the exact border. These invasions seemed to be punitive rather than land grabs, but the empire was still expanding eastwards. Given this expansion, it is understandable that the Eastern Empire was genuinely concerned by Charles's elevation to emperor. Actually, the nobles in Constantinople might have been grinding their teeth at the idea that some Frank had been elevated to an equal status, but the situation was merely irritating. No, the problem was that the barbarian status seeker had expanded his territory east, absorbing Bavaria and defeating the Avars. If Constantinople had been stable, it might have successfully opposed the so-called emperor, but it was far from stable. Having ruled on her own authority for 5 years, Irene was overthrown in a coup organized by her trusted eunuch Aetius, who backed Nikephoros, the finance minister. While the negotiations over a marriage between Irene and Charles were a likely factor, the key problem was the succession, namely the lack of a clear successor. Aside from the growing uncertainty as she aged, the failure to name a successor meant that Irene had failed to cultivate an alliance with a faction that could protect her as she aged. Remember, she basically had no claim to the throne. Maybe Irene had feared that a co-emperor would have simply pushed her off the throne anyway, but it is hard to avoid the conclusion that she had just avoided the problem. The coup is surprising only because it took relatively long. However, it is interesting that Irene was overthrown by a bureaucrat and not a general. It is fitting that she was overthrown by the head of the imperial treasury, who had probably dealt with her more than a general. Newly crowned Emperor Nikephoros soon found himself facing numerous problems. As the former head of the treasury, the new emperor knew that the problems were largely fiscal, since Irene had exempted monasteries from taxes, even though they were huge landowners, and she had cancelled the residence tax in the capital, so the empire was nearly broke. Nikephoros promptly restored the taxes and drafted poor men into the army to improve its ability to defend the frontiers. The taxes did not make him popular, especially since he was rigorous against bishops and monasteries, which produced histories of the empire. Still, the empire was soon fiscally sound. However, the main threat facing the empire was a man named Krum, a powerful leader of the Bulgars who was slicing off bits of imperial territory. This did not improve Nikephoros' popularity, but he reacted boldly. Emperor Nikephoros may have felt that he needed a victory to strengthen his position and possibly remind the Franks that the Eastern Empire was, well, an empire. Marching quickly into Bulgar territory, he found the Bulgar capital Pliska unguarded. The capital was burned, and then the emperor returned home. Still, the emperor was determined to end the Bulgar threat once and for all, so the next year he led a massive army after Krum. Able to count, Krum retreated and retreated until Nikephoros grew overconfident and marched into a trap. The army was destroyed on July 26, 811, and the slaughter lasted for over a day. Only a tiny number of imperial soldiers escaped. Nikephoros was among the dead, and his skull became Krum's drinking cup. This was the greatest defeat for the empire since Adrianople over 4 centuries earlier. Few mourned Nikephoros, which seems unfair since he had made the best of a bad situation. Still, a new emperor was needed, a military leader. Don't forget that upstart Emperor Charles the Frank was demanding recognition of his position. Nikephoros' son Storakios had survived the battle, but he had been paralyzed. Technically, he had been crowned co-emperor, but he would clearly die soon, so his brother-in-law Michael was crowned emperor. It would be awkward if there were 2 emperors, so Storakios was given a haircut and sent to a monastery. Now that Michael was comfortable on the throne, presumably he would deal with the Bulgars. No doubt, but he also needed to consider the situation with the Frankish Empire, which continued to expand. In fact, the amount of territory separating the two empires was rapidly decreasing. A key factor was the destruction of the Avars, which had enabled Frankish expansion into Croatia. Prince Voinomir, leader of the Croatians of Pannonia and Slavonia, had aided Charles in his conquest of the Avars. Once the Avar Khanate had been destroyed, he submitted to the Franks and was placed under the Margrave of Friuli. Missionaries soon entered Voinomir's territory, which was to be expected. In addition, the Margrave of Friuli tried to extend his rule further into the Croatians of Dalmatia, which was also natural, except that Dalmatia was technically part of the Eastern Empire. The northern part of Dalmatia was largely Croatian, while the southern part was largely Serbian. However, the islands and the walled cities had survived the Slavic invasion and remained Roman in culture and language. While they were officially governed by Constantinople, they had little or no contact with the city. Instead, they traded with Italian cities, which were located only a short sail away. However, both empires were expanding into the region. Sometime between 800 and 810, the Eastern Empire based a fleet in Durazzo to protect the coast against Arab pirates. Around the same time, the Franks had established control over most of northern Dalmatia by 803. Once Frankish overlordship had been recognized, missionaries began to enter the region. It is important to point out that the Roman Dalmatian cities each had their own bishops under the Archbishop of Split, which reported to the papacy in Rome, not the Patriarch in Constantinople. Open warfare between two superpowers would be disastrous, but peaceful relations were not on the table either, so the two empires found themselves in a Cold War. Actually, the Franks had their own problems in Italy. Inspired by Charles, Duke Grimoald of Benevento had decided to modify his status from autonomous duke to independent prince. As king of the Lombards, Pippin was tasked with maintaining Frankish dominance of Italy. So Pippin had marched south in 800 and 801, but does not appear to have accomplished much. In fact, Grimoald not only maintained his independence against Pippin, he even forced Winigus, who had succeeded Hildebrand as Duke of Spoleto, to submit in 802. While the submission seems to be a simple change of allegiance among Lombards, it was actually a blow to Frankish prestige. Hildebrand had been a Lombard who preferred submission to Charles to a war that he would lose. But Winigus had been a Frankish count before he had succeeded Hildebrand in 787, so the Franks had lost a loyal ally. Meanwhile, the Duchy of Benevento was surrounding Naples. Aside from the actual capital of Benevento to the east, it had founded a second major city at the port of Salerno to the south of Naples, and it had gained control of the old Roman city of Capua, which dominated the road between Naples and Rome. Constantinople was unable to support Naples against Lombard expansion, and the Carolingian kingdom of northern Italy does not seem to have been concerned with southern Italy as long as the Lombards did not threaten Rome. So Grimoald was free to expand as long as he focused his expansion south of Rome. To sum up, aware that he was old, Charles held an assembly to settle the succession. The empire would be divided among his three sons, Charles the Younger, Pippin, and Louis. Basically, most of the empire would go to Charles because he was the eldest, but Pippin and Louis would receive larger versions of their current kingdoms. Sadly, the Eastern Empire did not have a similar succession plan. In fact, the lack of a clear successor led to a coup against Irene, who was replaced by Nikephoros, a former bureaucrat. Relations between the two empires were poor, but the Bulgars were a greater threat to the Eastern Empire, so Nikephoros led an army against the Bulgars. Unfortunately, he marched into a trap and was killed along with most of the imperial army. While the Franks were expanding east, they also had to deal with Benevento, since Duke Grimoald had promoted himself to prince. Still, the key issue was whether or not the two empires could avoid a war, and I will answer that question next episode. Thanks for listening. If you like the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.